Welcome to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corp Institute of Public Policy and Economy. I'm your host, Mitch Davidson. Today, we're joined by Ontario's Education Minister, Stephen Lecce. Prior to being elected, Minister Lecce held senior communications roles in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office. He was then elected as the MPP for the riding of King Vaughan in 2018, and less than a year later, he was appointed as Ontario's Education Minister. In a year on the job, he's seen job action from each of the province's four major teachers' unions, negotiated new contracts with each of those unions, and most recently had to take the unprecedented step of shuttering schools to protect students against COVID-19. Minister, I know it's a busy time, so thank you for making the time to come onto the program.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so really appreciate you doing this. And I think, a good table setter of a question to get into it is the first part of your tenure when you were appointed as Minister of Education was all about the fight to keep kids in the classroom. And now, ironically enough, COVID-19 happens, and it's all about the fight to provide proper resources for kids while keeping them out of the classroom. That transition can't be an easy one to do, and making that decision to keep 2 million students at home for their own safety can't be an easy one to make. Looking back on it a little bit, knowing it was the right decision, can you just take us through how difficult a choice that was to make to close schools for COVID-19 safety purposes?
Yeah, no, listen, I appreciate the oddity of these sort of almost competing mandates, but for me, the decision point was made in the context of school closures pretty much exclusively on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. I mean, we were the first province in this country to do that because it was quite obvious in anticipation of March break and the concerns surrounding community spread that government had to take action. Regrettably, for a variety of reasons, just we had not seen that type of action or leadership taken amongst virtually any industrialized economy. We had to do that. It was a bit of a moral imperative, a health imperative, I'd argue an economic imperative, and therefore we made the decision. I would argue it is very tough. I mean, to be quite frank, I have nieces in the Catholic education system and a lot of friends in the public and Catholic education system. They're both educators and particularly their kids. And it's tough to upend a person's life. I mean, it's not just the child, which of course I have deep concerns about, changing their schedule and expectations, their camaraderie, the social and emotional benefits of their peers. But, I'm also concerned about their parents, right? From a productivity perspective, are they able to work? Are they able to manage all these pressures? Do they have people in the essential service economy? Do they have an aging parent, and perhaps in a senior's home or long-term care? So that the human dynamic as well. But I think upon reflection, it was absolutely the right thing to do because it's about saving lives, and that is the basis of our action.
Well, and in doing that, I mean, there must have been a little bit of trepidation being sort of the first one out the door there, right? Being the first province to make that decision. Now, you had the benefit of March break, gave you a couple extra days to consider it. But was there ever any concern about being the first province, or was this something where once you got that advice, you're clear and decisive on what you got to do?
I think we felt very strongly that we're dealing with a global pandemic, and in the absence of bold action, we will be a casualty at a rate that we saw, in Italy and Spain and in other parts of East Asia, and we were resolved to avoid that. And that's why we had to do that. So no, I wouldn't argue there was any sort of hesitation on the decision point. I think they were just a heavy conscience, just knowing that this is going to make a big impact on a lot of people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really fascinating point for listeners about, more than just the simple act of having kids being at home, the impact to the labor market and all those sorts of things. And obviously, as much as possible, we want to try and get students back into the classroom. So as we look to do that, especially, into the next school year, there's a renewed focus on health and safety measures, I'm sure, that we'll see in our education system. But there's also a good chance that many of these students will have fallen behind with the schools being closed for a few months now. Add in the summer break, whether they're from they have individual education plans, they're potentially from less affluent households, or students who haven't had parents who could stay at home and teach them during the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of research shows that these students could fall behind. You've taken a bold step already of procuring some iPads and data for students who may not be able to afford those sorts of technologies to continue their learning. But how concerned are you about students falling behind, and what do you plan to do to try and address that?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I I accept, within our society, there's inequality that exists inherently, and the aim of the ministry in education is, to the extent possible, really try to equalize that experience, to provide, to the extent possible, the access to the tools and materials that are needed to give these kids a hand up and an opportunity. And I really believe, as both as a generational public servant and as a conservative, that we have a duty to help those individuals achieve their potential and really optimize their skills, both in educational pursuits and ultimately in the labor market and the job market. So, this is about, really unleashing the full human potential of a person, and inherently everyone deserves dignity and opportunity. And so while I recognize, the distant virtual synchronous learning experience that is happening now is a strong start. And when you benchmark it nationally, it's a very good start, because some provinces, respectfully, don't have any learning program at all. I think what it shows is what it really underscores is that we are really embracing a sort of a pivot to the 21st century when it comes to the merits of the system, but we're also self-aware of some of the vulnerabilities, and that's why we spend such a effort on ensuring broadband was delivered to all schools, all high schools, for example, this September. Every high-speed internet, 1 gigabyte, in every high school in the province. And the next September, elementary schools will have it, and we're looking to accelerate that. It's why, we have leveraged a partnership with telecommunication, the private sector, leveraging the goodwill, the sort of spirit of Ontario, if you will, and I think the ingenuity of the private sector to deliver on public aims. For example, getting Apple, working with the leadership of Apple, working with the CEO and leadership of Rogers Communications, personally at my level, but of course my officials and team would have done a lot of the heavy lifting as well. But the point is building a provincial program that allows boards of education to procure low-cost, high-impact solutions, which in this case often was devices, iPads, 21,000 no less, have been procured. Many more are, as I understand, being procured, but those are the ones that have been delivered to date. Of a total of 200,000 devices that exist that have been largely funded by the province and by boards that are also out in people's hands. So I guess my point in short is, it offers great strengths, especially the synchronous experience of having all the students together in sort of a Zoom classroom style, using that's not the platform we use, but using that sort of for your imagination. Everyone together, there's a community feel, there's a sense of purpose. And the teacher, I think, really can make it insightful. Today, this morning, I was on a class, Le Petit Prince, in my community in Vaughan, with my colleague Gila Marta, the two of us, a French immersion school, great school. And I got to literally just listen in for half an hour, and then I got to comments at the end. And I honestly was so impressed. I mean, first of all, I thought the educator was amazing at using, sort of being very animated in delivery and keeping things fresh, and that the kids were engaged. They were interested. They were, I think, happy to be together. And I get it. And I'm the first to acknowledge, Mitch, this is not the same as an in-person experience, but my goodness, it is definitely better than the alternative, which is no experience. I think my aim today is to strengthen it, knowing that it can be better, knowing that the system needs the minister to ensure that kids get the very best out of it. And that's why I stand, taking a very strong position in ensuring that we close those gaps, that inconsistency that exists with respect to that dynamic live learning experience. And I think parents expect it. I want them to know that I will absolutely advance that mission, that aim, and just to try to get this right and make it as most impactful as humanly possible for these kids.
Yeah, and I love what you said about a pivot to the 21st century, because I think that's what we're seeing kind of across the board, right? Is no matter the area of society, the service that was provided is adapting and accommodating to this pandemic, and that'll have some lasting impacts when this is hopefully all over and we're able to go back to be at a classroom or your regular workplace, to have more technology intertwined into the system. And so one of the things that I thought the ministry has done very creatively was leverage the public broadcasters that they have, both TVO and TFO, to provide programming for students while they're at home. And I have to point out the podcast here is titled Intended Consequences, because we try to suggest policy ideas that achieve their intended goals. And I'm wondering if, on a similar vein to that, there's perhaps a different role for EQAO, the province's standardized testing arm, to tackle COVID-19 issues, be that maybe assessing student aptitude to see where they've fallen behind or perhaps gotten ahead over this break, maybe to do more regular testing during the school year to make sure that that students are able to progress with the standards that would have been expected should this never have happened. Have you thought a little bit about what role EQAO could play in a new environment?
I think you're right in noting that, within the ministry, for context, TVO, TFO, EQAO agencies all falling on the Ministry of Education. Absolutely, TVO and TFO, to be fair, have for many years been providing very effective educational content. TFO, for example, has over 1 billion views on their YouTube. They actually, for both agencies, have really effectively got their products, monetized them, got them out to other jurisdictions, English and French, and ultimately added good, a good complement to learning in our province, including support for our educators. So that was an important way to strengthen their existing mandate and quickly, literally, have them go into sort of a 24/7 focus on education programming on their television stations, which is what we did. But on the EQAO, their mandate is about assessment. And I think, one area of curiosity for all of us is, which we deserve to know, is, how do we measure success in this COVID experience, particularly while kids are home? And I think a question mark that remains, and an opportunity that could rest with the agency, is sort of providing some assessment around the efficacy of this experience and any perhaps advice or perspective on how to improve it. At this point, if I can be quite frank, EQAO tests have been canceled as a one-off for this year, given the exceptional circumstances of COVID and the fact that these tests cannot be written literally in this environment. But, I think I could just signal to you that optimizing the use of our agencies is my default. And I think we need to be better measuring successes in the education system or government, period. And that's why I think there's the role of EQAO, at least the principles behind it, of measuring student outcomes and progress is going to be critical now more than ever.
Yeah, and I think that's where the sort of question comes from, is the idea of just how do you make sure that students are still progressing with the expectations of the curriculum as set out, and for no fault of their own, right? They may not be able to progress in the way that they should have in a classroom. So how do you get them back on track as quickly as possible? I think another area that I wanted to ask you about, because I think a lot of people, similar to standardized testing, it may not be front of mind, is the whole aspect of childcare in the province of Ontario. And I know that we've talked a lot over the past few years with the new care credit, a refundable tax credit for Ontario families who have children in childcare. But that's based off a childcare expense deduction, which gives you a tax break for the costs that you incur on your childcare expenses. And though some of the things are eligible, educational institutions are eligible for the portion of costs that count towards childcare, but not for the portion of costs that count towards improving education, say like online tutoring or something like that. So I wonder if there's an opportunity there as well to rework some of the existing tax credits or tax codes to embrace the new move to online learning. And I'll just kind of leave that there and maybe ask you more specifically. You sent out a memo recently embracing online learning as a temporary step here during COVID-19. Hasn't necessarily been universally accepted by the education community. I'm wondering if you can just speak a little bit to some of the challenges with the live video learning and a message that you might have for teachers about how to do that properly.
Well, just very quickly on the childcare. Yes, indeed, in my ministry, it includes childcare plus education K-12. And I would just say, so far, I've been working with the federal government, and we've got a cooperative relationship between the federal and provincial governments in the context of how we respond to this outbreak. And I can say broadly, my relationship with, for example, Minister Ahmed Hussein has been constructive. And so when we've asked, for example, for childcare operators to be included in the emergency wage subsidy, the first iteration, it was not, as I recall, and it would have upon some advocacy. The point is the government's, I think, expanded that scope to reach more people. And the principle of your question, I think, is, how to make childcare more affordable, particularly now. And I think that's a sound principle. It's why we've been put in place emergency order to negate childcare operators from charging individuals, families, for services not being rendered. It's also why we came up with the stabilization plan, that enabled us to have our operators utilize federal grants, utilize the federal provincial rent subsidy, and then of course the province is providing a bit more support on the operating side. Together, that's going to help keep the solvency of the sector, which we know is critical to getting women and men back in the labor market. I would just say culturally, I say this as a public servant, as a conservative public servant, I believe the case study for childcare monies being provided directly into the pockets of working people, into pockets in their family, in their the pockets of working parents. I think now more than ever, the case study is true. Institutional daycare supports would offer no benefit under a closure program, whereas people still have childcare expenses. There's still an inherent cost to raising a child for a parent, particularly now while they're at home not using that service because they cannot. And so therefore, it makes the case that the mobile tax credit, which allows the parent, puts them in the driver's seat of choosing what type of childcare works best for them versus a one-size-fits-all. It is an ideological difference that exists within the legislature, and there's a single political vehicle that actually believes in parental choice and enabling them to make that decision that empowers them with the monies that I think they deserve to make, and that is our party. And I feel so strongly about that because while I support institutional daycare, my goodness, there needs to be a role for parents to have that say, to have that latitude and ultimately flexibility to move those dollars where it matters most for them, which is the base of the care tax credit, which, as you know, is providing over $1,200 per family on average with some of those supports, and that's going to help 300,000 people. But on the context of how we deal with the uneven application of sort of that synchronous online experience, I will say off the top, this is tough on the system. I mean, COVID-19 is challenging on the child most definitely, and their parent that has borne a lot of the responsibility. But, we have to acknowledge that for many educators, to be fair, some of them were already doing this form of virtual learning. They had it in the classroom in the cloud and everything was uploaded and it was very accessible. But for most educators, that would not be the normative practice. So they've had to do a pretty significant pivot themselves. And I think I want to give credit to the system for trying to adapt. But what I also believe is, given the exceptional challenges, the acute nature of this pandemic on a child, on their social, emotional wellness, on their mental health, I think it requires us to really rise to the challenge to deliver, I believe, what ought to be the expectation for education in the 21st century in this province, which is a credible, virtual, dynamic form of learning that enables the teacher where the teacher repatriates that responsibility, leads that program, goes through the curriculum, gives that parent an element of reprieve from that experience, and ultimately allows the teacher to teach and to do what they do best. And so that's why we feel strongly about it. That is why I put out another memo to make that case, because I believe we cannot exacerbate the unequal experiences that already exist within education. That's why, when I hear from a parent, my grade 6 son is, in this school is getting incredible online learning, but my grade, 4 daughter is not. It's an element of frustration for the parent, and it's being channeled through me. And I believe I have to stand up for trying to universalize that experience, because it is a positive one and it can be meaningful. And I am the first to acknowledge, Mitch, it's not the same as an in-class experience, but it is obviously the most effective backstop in this circumstance. And I think it's the way we're allowing kids to graduate with integrity this year. It's how we're ensuring that grade 12 students get into post-secondary, because this program is strong enough to allow them to accumulate credits and ultimately graduate with a report card. So that's why we're doing it. We're going to continue to do it. We're going to continue to hope that our federation partners will work with us to deliver on that. And I think the voices of parents, to be quite frank, Mitch, are going to outpower my voice on this. I see it every day in the news, on social media, organically driven, of people expecting it. And I think all of us will just really have to seize ourselves with rising to the challenge, because these kids deserve it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating parallel between the two answers there. The first on childcare and the second on the video learning is that it's always struck me part of the challenge in a sort of conservative philosophy to giving money back has been empowering directly families or individuals. And very rarely there's a stakeholder who's out there calling for the empowerment of the individual or the family, but there's commonly stakeholders who are calling for specific funding to sectors, to specific groups, to certain types of programs, but rarely to the individual. And I think the same is largely true for the Minister of Education. You have a lot of stakeholders, be them educational workers, principals, teachers, superintendents, what have you, calling for specific programs. And it's hard to necessarily get that voice from parents or for students directly, aside from perhaps some trustee associations and those sorts of things. So I do want to ask, because if we had you on the podcast 2 months ago, it would have been a lot of talk about the contracts with the teachers unions and not so much about COVID. I think we should go there. Looking back at that process, was it a success in your mind? How did it work? And what was the difference in getting a deal done with all four of the major groups?
I think the ultimate victor in this circumstance were our kids. I mean, they deserve a educational program that delivers on the priorities of their parents and of our students. And I think we did that in this negotiation. It was intensive. It was difficult, as they always can be. But at the end of the day, I've always reminded myself it isn't about me. I mean, I'm here to serve 2 million students. We have a mandate to ensure transformation within the system, to ensure our education system is modern and reflects the opportunities that exist today into the future in the job market. And I believe that there's a reason why we have twice the rate of youth unemployment in this province, in this country, because there's a mismatch of skills within what we're teaching our kids and ultimately what exists in the job market. And we have to do a better job of aligning that skills mismatch to better position students to graduate with the competencies required to get access to those good paying jobs. And that should not be an aspiration that died with, our generation or the generation before us. I think these kids need to know that if they work hard in this country and maybe, accumulate some debt maybe in post-secondary, but it's going to be worth it. They're going to get a decent job and they'll be able to own a home and maybe have a family and retire with dignity. That is the reason why people come to this country year over year, like hundreds of thousands, for that economic freedom and opportunity. And so we have to ensure that flame remains sort of burning in the hearts of our kids, so that they have that drive and determination. And so in the context of this agreement, wage restraint was important, because I'd rather see more money help our children and invest in schools and in our curriculum. That was a decision point we fought for. And I think the public overwhelmingly would say, yes, that was an important principle to defend. We made the case that funding needs to go directly to the child, focused on thematic aims that are relevant to students. We used to have a program initiative, the Local Priorities Fund, which has been retailored with an emphasis now on STEM education, special education, mental health. This actually reflects the priorities of those we serve, which that is our students. And when it comes to merit as a guiding principle of hiring in the system, I would argue that we've received material advances in this area, virtually across the board, where merit is now the guiding principle, or at least it is strengthened as a guiding principle when it comes to hiring, not seniority in the union, respectfully. That was important to advance. I mean, the easy thing to do would have been to just give up on this process months ago, but we felt it was vital when it comes to that modernization agenda, when it comes to advancing the priorities of those we serve. And that's why we did it. And we have a sense of gratitude to get it done. They've been ratified by our partners, I think 8 of 9 to date. And so, the goal right now is just to not look back, but to look forward to expanding upon our transformation, to drive modernization, to ensure that, the system actually reflects the economic imperatives of our province and country, as well as the social imperatives when it comes to creating value-based citizens that are prepared to serve and give back and contribute meaningfully to country.
Yeah, and you mentioned it's important to look forward and not look back, and I think that's where, as we approach the end of the podcast and sort of the last question for you, I want to leave us heading in that direction, because looking back quickly for a second, obviously the negotiations and then COVID-19 have really taken a lot of the bandwidth of the ministry to get those deals done, and then to deal with the pandemic. Looking forward, we're approaching quickly the halfway mark of the Ford government mandate here. assuming maybe that those priorities have been dealt with and hopefully COVID-19 goes closer into the rearview mirror, what can we expect to see from Minister Lecce, from the Ontario government in terms of education in the latter half of the mandate?
Yeah, I think we're going to just aggressively, continue to focus on that transformation agenda, moving our system, our education system into the 21st century, really looking forward to creating job-ready citizens that are ready to take on bold initiatives to remain optimistic about their own futures. But I think ultimately to give them the confidence that as they go through the journey of learning, they're going to have the skill sets needed to succeed in life. And that goes even beyond a job. And so for me, it's about realigning our curriculum with our labor market needs. We are unveiling a math curriculum in the elementary panel this September. That, for the first time in our province's history, will have, in addition to consultations widely with teachers and people involved and experts in the field, for the first time we have a labor market alignment, where a market sounding alignment, where we were actually able to bring in nonprofit and for-profit leaders, people across private enterprise, across every discipline of the economy, including labor, to give us perspective on the skill sets and the competencies and the knowledge that must be instilled in a student graduating in 2020, for example. That was extremely insightful. And so at each and every curriculum, in all our curriculum redevelopment, we're going to be having that lens applied and very aggressively tapped. And I think on technology, on online learning, ensuring professional development happens widespread for our educators to enable them, empower them to do their important work better. And many of them, to be fair, over 16,000 have already done that, to their credit. But I want to see that number rise. And I think also, there's an opportunity when it comes to just mental health, the resilience of our kids, knowing that, to be fair, and we know our own families, Mitch, and friends and people around us, this is tough on people. It's tough on all of us, but I think it's particularly tough to sort of change that schedule and upend the lives of a child, take away that, the emotional benefits they have from their friends. And so I think mental health will also be a priority. I think there's a clear productivity connection between a stronger workforce and a greater wellness when it comes to how individuals care for their body and their mind. And I want to see that for their health, but also from an economic perspective. I want to see a more productive workforce where people are able to work in this, especially now in this environment, where I think there's an additional level of angst for all of us. So we've got a pretty ambitious plan. Obviously, the Premier has just been leading, I think, with a real focus on enabling our kids to succeed. He wants to see them do well. I share that sentiment. And the work has, as you mentioned, and we finished the negotiations and we started up on the next initiative right after, because I think that sense of focus is going to really deliver a result for our kids and hopefully set them up to succeed.
Yeah, well, I mean, it certainly has been a busy year, and it sounds like it's going to be a busy couple of years moving forwards as well. So knowing how much you've got going on right now, we really do appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast, and thank you for doing this, Minister.
Thank you, and be well. Thanks so much, Mitch.
Thank you for listening to Intended Consequences, the official podcast of the Strategy Corps Institute of Public Policy and Economy, produced by Sarah Bordeaux and myself. Views expressed during this podcast are not necessarily the views of Strategy Corp. All rights to this episode are reserved, and guests on the podcast may be current or past clients of Strategy Corp. To find out more about the Institute and to subscribe to our written material, or to find past episodes of the podcast, please visit our website at www.strategycorp.com/institute. Until next time, I'm Mitch Davidson.